American birth costs are uniquely expensive in the world. The highest rate in the world, about $19,000 at the top end, and an average of about $3,000 to $5,000, even for people with good insurance.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's insane that we accept a de facto state-endorsed tax upon families for the arrival of each of their children at precisely the moment when those families should be most financially empowered to plan for their future thriving.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the co-founder and COO at American Moment. Really appreciate you joining us this week. In studio today, I have Tom Shakely, who is the Chief Engagement Officer at Americans United for Life. But before I get to him and the very exciting conversation that we had, just a couple things to plug about American Moment. As always, our website is americanmoment.org. That has not changed. If you are a young person looking to get involved in the movement, maybe you live in DC already, or you live somewhere else out in the US and you're trying to get here, if you fill out the americanmoment.org/join, we have a little web form there. If you fill that out, a member of our team will be in touch with you. We'll meet with you and try to find ways to get you plugged into the movement here in DC, whether that's getting you into events, getting you an internship, getting you a job. We highly prioritize our listeners that come to us in need of assistance. So we greatly love to support you. We'd highly recommend you do that. If you're an intern that's currently in DC, we're doing this great program right now called AM Fridays. It's a program where we basically provide a Chick-fil-A box lunch on Friday, and we're meeting over in one of the Senate buildings. And we have a number of engaging speakers, including Russ Vogt, Stephen Miller, Mark Krikorian, lots of great people. It's going to be a very enriching summer, and we think you'll learn a lot. So once again, that link is americanmoment.org/AM Fridays. So for our guest today, like I said, we had Tom Shakely from Americans United for Life. I tell people all the time, I say it in the episode, but I'm going to say it again. AUL is one of the best groups working on pro-life advocacy in DC. They're a fantastic organization, and everyone we know there is of very high integrity and doing a lot of great things. We highly recommend you check them out. It's aul.org is their website. We're big fans of them and all the people that work there. The conversation that Tom and I had today, we obviously talk about the pro-life movement, post Roe and then post Dobbs, and kind of where we go from here. We talked about an incrementalist versus an abolitionist approach to ending the scourge of abortion in the United States. But probably the thing that's most interesting, especially to people that are kind of new to the conservative movement, is this policy of make birth free. This is something that AUL has put forward, and if you've listened to the show pretty frequently over the last couple of weeks, we recently had Senator J.D. Vance from the great state of Ohio, and he talked about this policy proposal that was put forth by AUL. So Tom and I had a great conversation about this policy, about why conservatives can actually support it, why it's not, though many people were telling me all over Twitter that it was socialism. It's not a socialist approach to birth and having a pro-life frame, in the conservative mind. So it was a fantastic conversation. We also talked about the history of how birth has actually been free before. And how we've kind of supported mothers and childbirth in the past in the United States. So I highly recommend you listen to the end to make sure that you get all the juicy bits in there. So Tom Shakely serves as the Chief Engagement Officer at Americans United for Life. He's responsible for brand communications and development. Tom is also a research fellow at Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism, which strives to awaken the conscience on human rights and responsibilities, as well as bioethical issues. Tom holds a bachelor's in political science from the Pennsylvania State University, a master's in bioethics from the University of Mary, and a master's in human rights from the Catholic University of America. Tom has appeared on Fox and Friends and EWTN Pro-Life Weekly and written for Newsweek, the American Conservative, National Catholic Register, National Review, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, HuffPost, and many, many other nationally recognized media. Tom is a very hot commodity. He's doing a lot of great writing and advocacy for the pro-life movement. We're big fans of his and everything that he's doing at AUL. So enough of me blabbing. We will go now to Tom Shakely of Americans United for Life. Tom, thanks for coming on the pod.
Nick, it's such a pleasure to be here.
So, as you know, you're a very helpful listener of our show, so I'm sure you know how it goes. But we love to hear, from our guests who they are, how they got where they are. So, tell us a little bit about your history.
Yes. So, I did not ever think that I would be active in the pro-life movement in the way that I am. I'm Chief Engagement Officer at Americans United for Life, where I've been for about 5 years. But what drew me to the movement was not initially the politics of it, which sounds crazy maybe. So many people want to get to D.C. They think that's where things are going on.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I grew up in a Christian and a Catholic household. And life was good, I was an 80s kid, Cold War kid, as I joke about with some of my friends. 1987, it
Close
counts.
enough.
It counts, but for me growing up, being raised in a Catholic household, going to Catholic school, I was aware of certain issues relating to the culture war, right? And certainly abortion being one of those, but other issues too, patients' rights, assisted suicide, euthanasia. These things kind of came to the fore over time, where for me, when I was in high school, the Terri Schiavo case broke. Mm-hmm. And the high school that I went to, Archbishop Wood Catholic High School in Warminster, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, that was the same high school that Terri Schiavo went to when she was young.
And for listeners who don't know about that case, what was the...
Yeah. The Terri Schiavo case was the most prominent. It was a right to life case that ultimately became a right to die case. Mm-hmm. That's how the New York Times and other media ended up portraying it. Terri Schiavo was a young woman. She was in her 20s. She had an unexplained collapse that led to a loss of oxygen and a resulting brain injury. She was from the Philly area, she and her husband both, but they were living down in Florida at the time. And after her collapse, a long series of events took place, but eventually her husband went to petition the courts for the right to stop caring for his wife. Mm. Now, the way it was characterized, it ended up being characterized as a right to die case because he said, well, we just want to let Terri die. Mm-hmm. But the problem was Terri wasn't dying. She was disabled. She had a brain injury. But she didn't have any conditions that were leading to her imminent death. She wasn't terminal. She wasn't on machines other than a feeding tube. Mm-hmm. A feeding tube providing food and water, something we all need.
Yeah.
Not the same thing as a ventilator, something that's like really actively sustaining you. And so this case came to the fore because the national media descended on my high school and they wanted to know what do kids think about this, et cetera. And it became this big issue. And ultimately, unfortunately, Terri did die as a result, not of any natural cause, but as a result of a loss of food and water. She died of basically starvation and dehydration. That became a major pro-life case. It also galvanized my interest in the movement because I realized all of these things coming together, around the same time my grandfather was experiencing Alzheimer's and, he needed a feeding tube in the final months of his life because one of the effects of, in some cases at least, advanced dementia or Alzheimer's is among the things that you forget are literally what to do when presented with food or water, right? Like drink the cup, take the spoon, et cetera. And so the feeding tubes are critical for certain patients as a part of a natural process of dying. Mm-hmm. And so in any event, that came together, the Terri Schiavo case from a national media culture war story, connecting with my own family's experience of caring for my grandfather in his final years and days with Alzheimer's and realizing how many other Americans maybe without the kind of Christian intuitions that my family did of let's care for our grandfather, right? Let's not starve and dehydrate him to death.
Yeah.
How many other people there need the protection of good law and policy and aren't getting it, right? And so that led to ultimately a deepening interest for me after college of getting involved. And I ended up working later, providentially, as the executive director of the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network, a nonprofit founded by her brother, Bobby Schindler, and his family to care for patients not only in her condition, but also people facing patients' rights, denial of care issues across the spectrum. And that work ultimately led to me meeting the great folks at Americans United for Life and getting involved there. And I came on board about 5 years ago.
Yeah. So what is Americans United for Life? Especially in kind of what we've termed the Dobbs era, there are so many pro-life groups out there that are doing work on a lot of different things. What is AUL's kind of niche? What are you guys really focused on?
Americans United for Life is all about advancing the human right to life in culture, law, and policy. And so what that means is that we're focused certainly on the most preeminent issue of abortion when it comes to the right to life issues. But we're also focused across the spectrum of issues. So issues like patients' rights, issues like assisted suicide, euthanasia, issues like IVF, issues like surrogacy, all these things that are bound together with what it means ultimately to be a person. What do we owe one another? And what does the law owe us in terms of its protective effects? And so Americans United for Life was founded by a diverse group of people of all ages, backgrounds, and beliefs. Believe it or not, 50 plus years ago, it was 1971 that AUL came into being in Chicago at the time. And it was founded by a group of people who saw the cases that were going through the lower courts, the cases that would lead to ultimately Roe v. Wade and its companion case, Doe v. Bolton. And they founded this organization because they realized we need to have advocacy. We need to start speaking up. We need to try to stop this. And ultimately, when that particular effort to stop what became Roe v. Wade, failed, Roe v. Wade was handed down by 7 men on the Supreme Court. They invented a fictitious right to kill a child in the womb in Roe v. Wade. And fortunately now, as you mentioned with Dobbs, the Roe era is finally over. We're now in a post-Dobbs moment. But Americans United for Life shifted gears after Roe v. Wade came down to say we've got to now not only start chipping away at Roe, showing that this is bad precedent, it's not good law, that the effects are going to be disastrous for the American people, but also AUL's founders, I think, were really prophetic because they realized even in the early mid-1970s, they said, if the Supreme Court, or more writ large, if America accepts the idea that the preborn child in the womb is not a human being, is not a human person, is not entitled to the protections of the law, is not seen as an equal member of the human family, well, certainly we're going to do that to other members of the human family.
Yeah.
Maybe the aged, maybe the disabled, maybe others who simply have decided they don't want to live anymore. And so our founders, among them, a great attorney, Dennis Horan, was probably the most preeminent among our founders. And he and others wrote a whole series of books. One of them was Death, Dying, and Euthanasia. Again, this was in the late 70s. People at the time, some even in the pro-life movement, thought, these guys are a little crazy. I mean, sure, we've got Roe v. Wade. Sure, abortion's obviously wrong. But America's not going to legalize euthanasia. We're not going to have a country like that, are we? Where we just discard people? No way. And yet, as we've seen, right, that's an issue now coming to pass as well.
Yeah, and happening all across the West. I mean, you see this happening in Canada as kind of a safe haven now for people who want to pursue medically assisted.
A safe haven.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what they call it.
Say.
I shouldn't have adopted their language. It was my bad. We tell people all the time, including I'm sure several of our listeners have heard this, that AUL is the pro-life group most worth their salt in DC. We're big fans of you guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
But and if you any of our listeners, if you guys haven't checked them out yet, highly recommend it.
AUL.org.
Yeah, they're a great
organization. One of the best URLs.
Yeah, it's very, very short. But I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts about the pro-life movement overall, especially like since the 70s. You hear a lot of this debate in the conservative movement and particularly in the pro-life world about abolition versus incrementalism. There are a lot of debates about that. You have a lot of people now that in a post-Dobbs era are really focused on the states' rights approach. Give us the lay of the land. Where's the pro-life movement headed in the next decade or so?
Yeah. So as a bit of a prelude to that, I think it is important to understand, when we talk about something like abolition versus incrementalism, AUL has become known and has been known for years, decades now, as incrementalists. And as you mentioned, there are some who consider themselves abolitionists who think incrementalists, bad. This is a bad approach. Why did we come to this point? Why do we have these factions? After Roe v. Wade came down, right, the Supreme Court in Roe infamously, right, it looked at the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution and it faced head on. Does this 14th Amendment provide equal protection for the preborn child? And SCOTUS decided, no, it didn't. In fact, their reading of the 14th Amendment was that it provides a basis for abortion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's talking about pulling a rabbit out of the hat. And so with that kind of Supreme Court majority, not just in Roe, but then lingering on the court for years, showing no openness, no sign to reconsidering the faulty precedent that was Roe, pro-lifers had to respond to that reality and realizing if SCOTUS is not going to change its opinion anytime soon, we've got to change our tactics. And so the pro-life strategy, and when I say pro-life strategy, I don't just mean AUL, but really across the movement, all the great organizations, peers, partners, adopted incrementalism by and large as a tactical response to the strategic problem that was this intransigent SCOTUS, refusing to change its mind. And so he said, if we can't get them to do that today, what we can do is incrementally chip away at the faulty precedent of Roe. And we can do that by supporting the passage of strong, robust laws in the states that will provide the basis for test cases that lower courts can consider and that can continue to provide a basis through the American federalist system of government to have this conversation and to keep this as a live issue, because the states can pass certain laws, do what they can to advance it. Those will be debated in the courts. People will sue. The conversations will be had out in public. And eventually, the thought was, eventually we can get to a point where the membership of the Supreme Court is at least open to the idea that Roe was wrong, if they're not willing, even if they're not willing to accept the idea of constitutional personhood, which many see obviously there in the 14th Amendment. So the idea there is that not just that Roe was wrong by centralizing the issue, by SCOTUS saying, yes, abortion's great nationwide, but in fact that the court, many argued, we argued actually, AUL in its first ever amicus brief, friend of the court brief in the Roe v. Wade case, we argued for constitutional personhood on 14th Amendment grounds. We said clearly the 14th Amendment protects children on an equal protection basis. And so we didn't get that in Dobbs. Dobbs sent the issue to the states. It sent it to the political arena. The Supreme Court they said, like, we're going to wash our hands of this. We're tired of dealing with this. We're tired of every confirmation battle being implicitly or explicitly about Roe v. Wade. And so their approach was, we're going to make it a political issue that the people are going to have to decide democratically. And so we didn't get kind of the best case, which would have been the Supreme Court restoring the status quo ante prior to Roe, prior to 1973, which would have been implicitly and then explicitly, if they had ruled correctly, I think, that constitutional personhood is a reality. We didn't get that, but we got a pretty good outcome in Dobbs because now we can have this conversation in the states and similarly incrementally move to a place where one way or the other we achieve constitutional protections for the preborn child.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts of the movement, pre-Dobbs. I think you have a lot of people having conversations and thinking about, why did it take so long? Why was it so much time between 1973 and last year?
49 years.
What do you make of were there weaknesses or mistakes there, or do you think it just required that amount of time?
There were a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of problems to be confronted, to be overcome. A lot of that, though, to be charitable, is just the working out of the political process. We didn't realize for a long time as a movement, and whether you want to say, we're Republicans, we're pro-lifers, we're whatever, there were pro-life Democrats for a long time. And so you look at the kind of justices, for instance, that, look at the Roe Court. Who appointed justices on the Roe Court? People like Nixon. Who appointed people to the Supreme Court that handed down Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992 that reaffirmed the so-called fundamental finding of Roe, which was abortion, even though it invented a totally new fictitious basis for it, It threw out Roe's trimester framework and invented a new paradigm for the reason for abortion. We got those justices from mostly Republican presidents, people like Ronald Reagan, right, in the case of the Casey decision. And so it took us, I think, until kind of the Trumpian moment for all of the stars to align and for people to realize everybody knows these confirmation battles are really about abortion. We pretend they're not, and we kind of make the justices do this sort of dance. I think essentially what we were doing was we were forcing them in a certain sense to lie by kind of pretending. You hear some of these people, get up. I think whether Kavanaugh was one of them or not, but one of the recent appointments, Gorsuch or Kavanaugh or somebody, they kind of made the guy like, I haven't thought that much about Roe v. Wade, about abortion. And it's like, give me a break, man. Like, you've been to law school in this day and age post Roe, and you haven't thought that much about it. And so I think by ripping off that Band-Aid and realizing, let's just confront it, let's make it an explicit litmus test, right? And so eventually you get somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, who I think responded so well when all the Democrats are coming after her and saying like, do you acknowledge that Roe is a super precedent? It's a super precedent. They keep using this word and really trying to get her, it's been here for so long. It's been here almost 50 years. Won't you acknowledge this? And she says, I'm hearing a lot of conversation about Roe v. Wade. And as a justice, I'm paraphrasing her, she says, like, the fact that this is being brought up so much in itself, to me, shows that this is not a settled issue and that it can't be a super precedent. Yeah. Also, why would there be so much debate about it? Yeah. I mean, I think she handled that perfectly and captured exactly the moment we had come to, which is that, we're confronting it head on and we're realizing we need to create a litmus test as we have for continuing future justices. Now that we've got Roe reversed, we've got to have a litmus test for constitutional personhood, I think, for future justices, for at least having that conversation. That's been an area, I think, if you follow the debates within originalist school thinkers, this idea that some, we even have this conversation within AUL of what's the best approach today. And you mentioned abolitionists a few minutes ago. We've been critiqued by some friends of ours who are abolitionists because their approach, they would say, we just need to pass, states need to pass laws that say it's fundamentally prohibited, there's no exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. This was before Roe. And we would say, well, that's a great ambition. We want to abolish abortion. That's what we're all about as a movement and as an organization. But at the time, we needed those kind of incremental test cases so that the court would simply hear the case rather than just say, no, let's strike that down. It's incompatible with Roe. Yeah. You needed to kind of get under the guns, right? To use a military analogy, under the radar, in a certain sense, to get the issue in front of them. And that's even what we saw in Dobbs, which it wasn't a case where Mississippi, which brought the case that led to this, the issue that the court originally picked up in Dobbs was whether all, prohibitions on abortion prior to 15 weeks are unconstitutional. Yeah. And they took that question and then said, actually, the whole thing is a mess. We're throwing it out. And so in that sense, we're all working now post-Dobbs toward the same end, which is abolition, but by different means. And I think we're going to continue to see that play out in the political process. We're going to continue to, I'm sure, make some mistakes here and there. But I think there's a lot more clarity about what we're going to. All of the groups, Americans United for Life, Live Action, Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America, National Right to Life, et cetera. We all, on whatever level, agree that abolition is the ultimate aim.
Yeah, totally. I'm interested to hear what you guys are, on the incrementalist side of things. What kind of states you're most excited about the laws kind of moving forward right now, and what you guys are really focused on post-Dobbs? Yeah.
I think, so I'll plug AUL.org. Again, we have a great state spotlight on the website that shows you a national map and the state of the states on our state spotlight. And it goes through, since Dobbs has come down, almost half the states in some way or another have either put into place an entirely new paradigm of protection for the unborn child or strengthened existing protections. You saw this probably most prominently in the case of Florida with the great Governor Ron DeSantis, where Florida for a long time had shocked people because the stereotype of Florida as a more conservative state, a reddish state, or purple until most recent elections, now solidly red. Florida was a southern abortion destination. Abortion was legal there till beyond 15 weeks. And when you look at the map of the South, that's where you would go if you were in another state that had protections that they were going to put in place. And DeSantis made moves not just to bring protections to 15 weeks, but then ultimately to 6 weeks, which is, the heartbeat stage. Heartbeat bills are very important because they move, I think, they move the heart quite literally. People resonate with that as an incremental step toward abolition. They say, like, why wouldn't we, once a child has a heartbeat, say that the law should confer at least some protections on them? And you see, like, New York Times and other secular mainstream media or something, they'll say, oh, it's not really a heartbeat. They say that from a medical standpoint, what pro-lifers call a heartbeat, they say, is really a fetal pole cardiac activity. That's what we call it medically, right? So it's sort of the distinction, like, it's not a baby, it's a fetus, which is just a Latin word that means little person, right? Yeah. It's just like, you pick your reason to dehumanize, you pick your basis for it. But I think Florida's been a great state with that, and so many others have as well. Mississippi, Texas. States also are passing wider packages, so not just doing things like restricting or abolishing abortion at certain weeks or at conception, but also recognizing that we've got to shift and to provide actual public support, state support for families, for mothers. One of the great victories, I think, from a Federalist standpoint or from just a kind of a Tocquevillian standpoint over the course of the fight against Roe was that you had people from across, not just religious backgrounds, certainly across denominations, but across cultural backgrounds, recognize, we need to set up alternatives for people to abortion. Planned Parenthood's in almost every community. Planned Parenthood is state funded, government funded to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. Where are women to turn if they want a choice that's not abortion? And so you see the great rise of pro-life pregnancy resource centers, right? PRCs. There's a PRC basically for every county in the United States. There's about 3,000 PRCs. Almost all of these are small-ish to medium-sized charitable organizations, sometimes run on a voluntary basis, that are there to provide things like diapers and wipes, provide transport for new families, baby seats, strollers, even things like rent assistance, tuition assistance, job training, job placement, the whole spectrum, depending on the organization you're looking at. And we realized that post-Dobbs, the state should be supporting this directly. It should have been doing it before that, frankly. And it's not like we want to compete with or put out of business all those great pregnancy resource centers. But states like Florida and Texas have put up big bucks. Texas has a $100 million fund, abortion alternatives fund, that exists to support things like PRCs, but also to say that the state has an interest in providing for life-affirming choices.
Yeah,
that's a great step, especially in a context where even so many conservatives say that the state, the most important thing is decentralization. Don't let the state do anything. If the state does it, it's bad. It's a great endorsement of the role of the state for protecting life and actually affirming families.
Yeah, and there are great conservatives in both of those states really pushing stuff like that forward and prioritizing families. I want to. That's a great segue into what I'm most excited to talk about here. We raised a bit of a ruckus when we had Senator J.D. Vance on our show for episode 100.
It's a great episode,
and yeah, it's one of the best I think we've ever done. But one of the things that he talked about was this proposal that's been put forth by the great folks at your organization called Make Birth Free, and we kind of set off a bit of a ruckus with that. Had a lot of people saying that's socialism. You can't do that. We're going to become just like the left. So what is Make Birth Free? What's the proposal, and why is it something that conservatives should consider supporting?
Yes. Make Birth Free was a policy paper that we put out just the week of the March for Life this past January, the 50th anniversary of the March for Life, 50 years of marching for life. And we thought to ourselves at AUL, now that Roe is gone, now that Dobbs is here as a new paradigm, what are pro-lifers going to do over the next, frankly, generation? It's going to be at least a generational fight to actually abolish abortion. It took us 49 years to get rid of Roe. It may take as long, ultimately, to really abolish abortion, let alone, again, not even speaking about some of the other social issues on that spectrum of human right to life issues that must be confronted and addressed. But we thought to ourselves, what are we going to do that's not just what we get characterized for unfairly, I think, stereotyped as like, oh, they're just about bans, restrictions, They just want to prohibit everything, right? That's what the left would say. That's what pro-abortion folks would say, ignoring the crisis pregnancy centers and all those other good things. And we said we need something affirmative, life-giving, that supports the mother, but also that looks to connect the pro-life movement with the larger concerns of the family, the American family, the American household, community life, and the common good, right? And so these are the big, broad ideas, but we really said, like, abortion has for half a century riven the American heart. It's literally eliminated tens of millions of Americans, brothers and sisters who should be here right now with us, working alongside us, right there on the metro, going to school, living lives, having families of their own, and they're not here, right? And so we said, we've got a crisis, though, as well with fertility rates, with family formation. There's a social science point that's well known, which is that pick any family, no matter how many kids they have. Say you've got 3 kids. You and I both have 1 child so far, right? Thanks be to God.
Yeah.
And imagine that that's all the Lord provided for us. 1, we would still wish, right? Naturally, oh man, would have been great to have 2, right? Would have been great to provide a little brother, sister, right? That is a well-known phenomenon in social science where people will say whatever number, they might have 7 kids, 10 kids. They say their ideal number of kids is always 1 more than they actually have, right? Isn't that a wonderful testament, by the way, to just the human nature to love and to nourish, that we see how good children are? We want more. Why not? Why not have another child? Wish we could, right? And so that idea is something that is studied. It's a sociological reality. But we said we can actually use public policy to help bring about more children for families. That's what making birth free is about saying to public policy stakeholders and to the American people that Congress has a role to support mothers, families, and communities by making birth free at the point of delivery. So we're not naive, starry-eyed idealists saying we're just going to somehow wave a wand and eliminate the cost related to pregnancy or childbirth.
Yeah.
What we're saying with make birth free is that the direct cost should be eliminated to families, because birth, pregnancy, childbirth, the whole process is unlike anything else in medicine. In any other case, you're going to the hospital because you've got some kind of malady. You've got a condition that you've got to get looked at, right? You're not feeling well and you got to get checked out. Birth, certainly there are high-risk births, and those need hospitalization for certain reasons that are underlying. But those underlying reasons were underlying reasons. They weren't something that was uniquely surrounding the birth of the child or the pregnancy. And so we said, pregnancy and childbirth shouldn't be treated like everything else. The whole cost, right? You think about of copays and deductibles with private insurance plans. The whole reason that those exist is because they want to try to disincentivize people from needlessly utilizing care.
Yeah.
Right. And so you think of like the hypochondriac, right? They want to go to the doctor every month, right?
Yeah.
Just make sure everything's okay. Well, why is it that we would have copays and deductibles to discourage kind of frivolous use of healthcare like that, limited resources on the doctor's time, the nurse's time, the material goods? But when it comes to childbirth, we say, yeah, we should keep those copays and deductibles. We should make sure that people have skin in the game financially for childbirth. It's an aberration. That's all it is. And so by eliminating those costs, one of our proposals in the white paper is we say, just do what the Affordable Care Act did for things like contraceptives, even sterilization. A lot of people don't know that. The ACA makes sterilization a no-fee procedure in many cases, which I think is crazy. So it's
what
like
a culture of death. Like that is so terrible.
Right. We actually have existing state policy. We have a precedent through the ACA, through federal healthcare law, that incentivizes people to not have kids and to never have kids again, and so that's why we think it's so natural to talk about making birth free. In a certain sense, what we're doing is leveling the playing field. It's kind of it's an okay result, but I think the best case scenario is not just leveling the playing field, but actually tilting it back in favor of goals for life, which is helping American families come together and realize that from the first moment they realize they're pregnant, husband and wife, man and woman, can go and get that OB appointment and not pay, we paid like $60 copays every time we went to our OB, right? For each of those appointments. And the $60 adds up. The cost of the birth adds up. American birth costs are uniquely expensive in the world. The highest rate in the world, about $19,000 at the top end, and an average of about $3,000 to $5,000, even for people with good insurance.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's insane that we accept a de facto state-endorsed tax upon families for the arrival of each of their children at precisely the moment when those families should be most financially empowered to plan for their future thriving.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, too many conservatives, even as you say, not that many, fortunately, but some conservatives look at that and they say, well, but for the state to intervene, for the state to get involved in federal healthcare spending, that would be socialism. And some friends of mine, right, have raised that concern, and like, God love them, the U.S. spends more than $1 trillion on federal healthcare spending currently every year. The U.S. government at a national level is already so involved in directing so many facets and aspects of healthcare policy, you wouldn't believe it. And so just at the most broad level, the idea that making birth free, that eliminating those direct costs through something like an ACA-style mandate to insurance companies, not the government even in that paradigm, is socialism, is, I think, frankly, probably the most charitable view is that people just haven't actually thoughtfully engaged the policy paper. It's only 8 pages. It's a very fun read. Yeah. It's on AUL.org/makebirthfree. But that's an example where there are these kind of brainworms, even for some on the right, that just for them, when they hear like government doing X, in other words, people electing representatives to enshrine law, and they say, oh, that's socialism. And it's like, we just got to get past that paradigm. Yeah. It's not 1981 anymore. Our problem is not like, Carter style stagflation. It's not, overregulation. We don't need more decentralization. We actually just need the proper wielding of political power for enacting good policy in a centralized way, right? That's what the whole purpose of the state is about, is making sure that people are not preyed upon. I think Senator Vance stated that so eloquently in your episode when he spoke to Make Birth Free. He used that great like $10 phrase, immiserated, that insurance companies or the government shouldn't be in a position to immiserate families by slapping them with some crazy expense, some insane expense of like, oh, you went to the wrong anesthesiologist. It's $20,000.
Yeah.
It's out of network.
Yeah. We, well, my wife and I, when we were going through our birth class and everything, it was like something like half the birth class was about how you can avoid, the crazy charges like that. Like things like, seriously, if they bring an anesthesiologist, asking them to wait out in the hall until you absolutely need it, because otherwise it's going to be like a $10,000 charge or whatever. So the costs are absolutely insane to be sure. I'm curious to hear about, and if you could speak to what something like this would cost as well, I think that would be helpful. But how would this impact the different stakeholders? Everyone from, insurance companies and hospitals to families with a desire for many children to women having children out of wedlock. What's the impact to all the different groups that have an interest? Yeah.
That's a great question. It's a broad question. I'll do my best. I think the most direct impact is that it would make pregnancy and childbirth a default for America in a way that it has not been for a long time. And there's no question that state policy can't solve it overnight. It's not a silver bullet. There are plenty of examples of governments across, you can just look since 1500. I mean, France tried this still when they were still under the monarchy, of incentivizing childbirth, fertility through certain social prestige, through certain incentives, because each culture at a certain point has the problem we're facing now, which is decreasing fertility. And whether you want to pinpoint the reason for that as out of control costs that make it impossible to have a family in a place like Washington, D.C., right, where the average property is like $600,000.
Yeah.
It's like, tell me about how you're going to have a big family, right?
Isn't that only for like condos too? Like if you're going to buy an actual brownstone, it's like $3 million or something like that.
No, I know. In Arlington, right, there are all these wonderful like post-war little ranchers and things that were put up and I guess GIs and so forth, we're getting those houses, like Sears Roebuck type houses.
Yeah.
And you're seeing them get purchased for like $600,000-$700,000, demolished, and then like a $2.5 million, 5,000 square foot, 6-bedroom house is being put up for, whatever, the lobbyist or something here in DC who can afford that, but who probably doesn't have 6 kids.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are you doing with it? Anyway? Yeah. But these are all great examples of the situation we find ourselves in, where we really need to change what we're doing, because trying is really half the battle. So we first need to resolve to try. Change, do something different. And so making birth free, I think, would affect a lot of different groups positively. To this question of cost, we, again, in our policy paper, we outline a few different methods of implementation. Can kind of pick your preferred method, as our approach is. We're talking with people on Capitol Hill. We are hoping to see congressional action on this. Our boldest approach, this is what I argued for in a debate recently with Megan McArdle of the Washington Post at Catholic University. Our boldest approach at AUL is like, you're going to the negotiating table, ask for the world, right? Like, why negotiate for less initially? See what you can get. So what we've said is, the one plank in our policy paper says you can do this through the government. You can have essentially like a Medicare for pregnancy. If Medicare for all is too much for you, if you don't want to be in with Bernie Sanders and those guys, just do Medicare for pregnancy, which would essentially expand existing Medicare and Medicaid policies. Currently, those programs already make birth free for nearly half of the population. A lot of people don't know that. But it's all done in kind of a wonky, means-tested way, where it's like, if you demonstrate that you are financially indigent enough, then begrudgingly the government will come in and will help eliminate some of these costs that are mostly made up anyway. And so we realized, like, if this paradigm is already working for nearly half of the population, we can expand it. And so that would be that approach, the kind of Medicare for pregnancy approach or Medicaid approach, would be the government coming in, and a cost for that would be something like another $50 to $60 billion a year, which we think would be a great investment, frankly. We noted in our policy paper, we spent about double last year in supporting the war in Ukraine. Whatever your feelings on that issue, there wasn't a debate about that. Yeah. Right. And so that people now are looking at this and saying, like, half that much to make birth free for American families. We've got to have a serious debate about this. It kind of gives away the game, I think, a bit about what our priorities are with finances and social ends. But so that's kind of the big, bold approach. It would do other things. It would create a benefit like a Social Security style payment for families, so that for the first year or two after the child's birth, that family would get monthly payments. Think of like the stimulus payments that many got during the COVID pandemic. And this would do that for families with children. So again, not just eliminating the direct costs, but actually also supporting them so that they can, whether they want to put that money into a Vanguard 529 or whether they want to use it to buy a stroller, they'd be able to do that. And we'd be using tax money to incentivize this, the same way we use tax money to do all sorts of things like pave the roads that we all drive on because we're a society. So this is one of those areas where it raises for folks who hear that kind of stuff and they kind of like, sit up and they're like, what is this about? It helps them, I think, helps us as a whole community get back to this idea of like, the political community is ordered to the common good, which is not the greatest good. It's not the thriving of some or the elite or whatever, or the privileged, but all. And so in that sense, it's a travesty, we think, that, right now you have to sort of, we know many people, as we were researching this, there are lots of instances of people who will be working 2 jobs or something and doing pretty well, but they realize like, hey, it's actually because I'm kind of on the borderline, it's actually cheaper for me to quit one of those jobs and take fewer hours of the other job so then I can qualify for Medicaid coverage for my pregnancy. Like, that's pretty messed up. Yeah. Right? Like, that's a distorted social policy. And so we can fix that with a Medicare for all approach for pregnancy, I should say. If you don't want to go that route, which would involve the government assuming that added expense, which again, although, $50 billion, it's not nothing. But it does, if you look at it within the broad picture of the current budget, that's about like 0.5% of all current federal healthcare spending. Yeah. So if your big thing is like, this is outrageous, that $50 billion, we spend over $1 trillion currently. Yeah. So like, if your issue is like waste, fraud, and abuse, like, go fix that. Yeah. Before you're going to complain about this. But in any event, if that's not your thing, probably the most politically palatable, we think, approach, which we're happy to see happen, happy to accept, at the negotiating table is the ACA style private insurer mandate. And the beauty of that is that it adds no cost for the federal government. It adds no cost to the taxpayers. There would, because the government would be mandating private insurers cover pregnancy, childbirth, and related services as a part of insurance without copays, without deductibles. There's no doubt that premiums would be impacted to some degree. But again, that's a good thing, because you think about an analogy would be property taxes and public schooling. Whether you have children or not, whether you send your children to public school or not, you're paying property taxes. Why? Because we say that schooling, that education is a public good. And even though the outcomes of public schools are generally atrocious, people way below reading levels, way below math competency levels, whatever, the principle is correct. That's why things like school choice is so important in states that pass it, because it actually gives people, the families, the freedom back to use that money that really is theirs for the good of the community. It's not just the education of one child or one family, but for the whole community to thrive. It does impact us severely when some are excluded, when some are below those reading levels and so forth. We take the same approach of property taxes in public schools to something like an ACA style mandate, where premiums will rise for some. And that's fine, because it's going to result in a paradigm where you think of like, take the person who's been, maybe on the internet too much, and they think that the world is going to end, or they think they're the reason the world is in such a bad shape. And they've gone out and they've used that ACA benefit. They've gotten themselves sterilized, right? They're living the world, their crimes are going to end with them, right? They're not going to have any kids. They're not going to have a family. Well, they're still a part of society. And with this paradigm, their insurance premium increase, if it happens, is going to help pay for the childcare and births and related costs of those who do have children. Because that's what the country's all about. We're knit together. We're bound together. As rugged and individualistic as we are as Americans by nature, right? We want to do things on our own. We are a society. This is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. It's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Our whole order is about the public welfare, the general welfare. That's what this is at heart. That's what making birth free is about at heart, is actually strengthening that, promoting it, enriching it. And so we think the private insurer mandate is probably a pretty attractive thing that makes sense to people. No cost for the government, and only really benefits for those with private insurance. The downside, of course, is you need private insurance to get it. And so that would still result in Medicare and Medicaid doing what they're doing, paying for almost half of births. For those with insurance, they would get that benefit. And, it wouldn't be universal in the way that kind of a Medicare for pregnancy would be, but it would be, frankly, a great outcome, a great incremental step.
Yeah. What do you think the impact would be? I'm assuming it's generally positive, but I think I've seen these, studies done where, the number one reason why people decide to stop having children or whatever is the cost, how expensive it is, not just throughout childbirth, which is obviously an insanely expensive process, but even child rearing. What kind of effect do you think this would have on just the general fertility and growth of our nation?
Yeah, it's hard to say with certainty, because I think, my take on kind of our fertility crisis and the family formation crisis is that there's definitely a major economic aspect to it, right? People who have been taught, trained, whether by their family or by their universities or whatever, don't even think about dating seriously or having a family until, you've got that partner level track or whatever the thing is, right? And that has misled so many, because they end up like in their 30s or even 40s, and they're like, okay, I think I'm ready to finally have a kid. And they look around and it's too late for whatever set of reasons. So I think as a social signal, I think this is a really important mechanism that would have a positive effect. I don't know for sure how to measure that immediately, but there's no question, again, by creating a new cultural default, where it's like everybody knows that there's no cost to have a kid. Like, why not? Why wouldn't you? Why would you wait? If you want them. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of positivity there. But there's also something, as we're talking about this, that I'll read from you actually an article, just a few excerpts from an article a guy who I was not familiar with before he wrote this piece that came across our radar after Make Birth Free. His name's Alan Carlson. He was appointed by President Reagan to the National Commission for Children. He's retired now, but he wrote a piece for the Institute for Family Studies after we put out our policy paper. And it was really a gift of a piece. He told us about a history that we knew nothing of. And his piece is called The Forgotten History of America Making Birth Free. It turns out we've done this before, believe it or not. And that's what Alan writes about. So he says that, quote, these advocates have actually resurrected a sharp, if now largely forgotten policy debate over the very same issues conducted a century ago, the triumph and eventual failure of the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act. This is around 1919. Is this amazing?
Yeah, this is very interesting.
So it was like immediately go to Wikipedia and I'm like, is this real? Like, what's going on? And Carlson writes about this. This was, you think about you're 1919. You're at the tail end. Your World War I has taken place. There's been this disastrous social dislocation. The communists are just starting to come to the fore. I mean, the world is such a different place, right? And the way that Americans thought about social policy was in such a different place. And so this Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act was all about doing what we're talking about now, again doing by making birth free. It was a comprehensive program. And so Carlson writes, dedicated to baby saving, the Bureau for Children that was set up organized National Baby Week. Over 4,000 communities and an amazing 1.1 million women took part in a baby care seminars and good-natured best mother contests. Love that. So wholesome. And heard orators praise motherhood as a vital element of national welfare. So you see the story of this and you think like, you realize first, like how true that is that the past is a foreign country. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I can picture that, people getting up on their soapboxes and the orators talking about the glories of motherhood and family life.
And why they're the best mother. And
exactly. Right. So wholesome. And so, the critical thing about this was that the act, didn't set means testing or income limits or anything like that. It really was a universal program. It ultimately, he talks about kind of what led to its downfall. But before that, let me talk about the interesting array of social forces that came together to support this Maternal and Infancy Act. He says that the support for this was among the largest and most effective lobbying campaigns in American history. Proponents of the Shepherd-Towner bill, as the measure was called, rallied an impressive array of allies, including the settlement houses of Chicago, New York, and other large cities, and their wealthy donors. The hundreds of upper crust women's clubs spread across the land, the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, we need these back, the National Council of Jewish Women, and even the Daughters of the American Revolution. The American Medical Association fiercely opposed the bill as the opening wedge of socialized medicine. The AMA called it, quote unquote, sob stuff. However, the physicians, Carlson writes, were overwhelmed by the literal millions of letters that poured into Washington, D.C. And so this led ultimately to being passed overwhelmingly in Congress. It was signed by Republican President Harding, and it went into effect, and it was in place for about 10 years. It ultimately, it started to face problems in 1927. The political winds had shifted. The AMA and other opponents of what was making birth free at the time through this act started to charge that the effects of this were Bolshevistic was the charge. Communist, right? A more maybe sharp-tongued version of that more lame socialism charge.
Yeah.
But the result of this, right, was that this act, which had led to thousands of doctors and nurses being funded basically by the government through this Maternal and Infancy Act to go out across the country in cities, in rural communities, there weren't really the suburbs yet, to educate women about maternal health, about their own health as hopeful mothers even, to show them what were the things that led to high maternal mortality, what were the things that, what were the behaviors that you can change that would help to ensure that your baby's going to be born in the healthiest way. That's what this was all about, making sure that whether you lived in the heart of the city, whether you were wealthy, because again, it wasn't means tested, it was universal, or whether you were a farmer's daughter out in the countryside, these folks were there. And for that 10-year period, they're changing the culture. Maternal mortality dropped. Various forms of child illness dropped as a result of this. It was a great success story. But again, what killed it was ultimately, discontent and ultimately fracturing kind of among the women's bloc. The Daughters of the Revolution kind of defected by the late 1920s, kind of concerned maybe this is Bolshevistic. We're the Daughters of the American Revolution after all. And I love them, by the way. I'm a son of the American Revolution, so no shade against the DAR, but mistakes happen. And this was one of them because by 1927, Congress did renew this act for one more period with the provision that it must sunset in 1929.
What a terrible year for it to
right. You think, when I was first reading about this, I'm like, oh, this must have ended because of the Great Depression. And it's like, no, it ended because of fractured political will, essentially, and just silly kind of nascent culture war disputes, essentially.
Yeah.
But that's the forgotten history of making birth free that Alan Carlson writes about. And so in that sense, we can kind of take heart, especially if you're listening and you think you're kind of a skeptic of it. You think, the state shouldn't intervene in this way, or, it shouldn't even tell insurance companies what to do. What's the state? It's like, okay, look at the history we have. Look at this, Maternal and Infancy Act of the 1920s. Look at the success it had. Research this.
Yeah.
Realize that we've done this before. We could do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, if you send me the link to that article, I'll make sure we put it in the in the show notes so that people can check it out. You talked about the political coalition around that bill. I'm curious what it looks like, as it relates to make birth free. I mean, you have at least one senator from the great state of Ohio.
That's right.
that is supportive of it, and obviously, no need to reveal any private conversations you've had or whatever. Yeah. But generally speaking, like what's the coalition for a bill like this? How would it actually happen?
Yes. Well, I think, our hope is that whether this happens, tomorrow or in a few years' time, that this will be a truly bipartisan moment in Congress for the pro-life movement. And if that's not your thing, you could say for the pro-family movement or whatever, if you're on the other side of the aisle. But there's interest from both sides. It wasn't just Senator Vance who spoke warmly about it. It was also Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. He tweeted about it. He tweeted, I think it was a piece in the American Conservative. Yeah. Bradley Devlin wrote about, it was a great title. It was Babies Are Good.
Yeah.
It's just like, I like making birth free. Babies are good. We need to get back to like simple principles, right?
I did a double take when I saw that he tweeted that article. I was like, is this a parody account?
Yes.
Like he's tweeting Brad Devlin. Wait, what's happening?
I love to kind of like the, obligatory, like, I think these people are bad, like, where it's coming from. But the idea is good, right?
Yeah.
And he did applaud universal child care in this way. And so I think that shows the potential. We know, again, from conversations we've had, that there's a much greater groundswell of interest on both sides of the aisle for this kind of thing. I think the great challenge for the Democrats is going to be getting over their trepidation, or maybe their political concerns about being seen to work with kind of pro-life, pro-family interest, because aren't those, bad?
Yeah.
So that's going to be a thing that they're going to have to get over. And Republicans in general are going to have to get over kind of the fear that some, frankly, within the halls of financial capital are going to whisper into their ear, which is this is socialism. To do that, as we've seen with Alan Carlson's great piece in history, ignores American history. It ignores what has been efficacious, but it also ignores common sense, which is that the state exists to get involved in these kind of things, whether you want to go with the Medicare for pregnancy approach or whether you want to go with like an ACA style insurance mandate. It exists to do this. Tell me if you think that this is socialized or inappropriate in some way. Tell me about the hospital that you would be excited to go into for whatever, knee replacement, heart surgery or whatever, that was not regulated with health and safety standards by the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't feel comfortable going into an unregulated hospital. Those are called abortion clinics, right? Yeah. Those are Planned Parenthoods, right? And pro-lifers rightly say that there's a need for health and safety regulation on those. Mm-hmm. And so we're suddenly going to say there's not a role for the state in increasing access and increasing services for bringing new Americans into the world. Give me a break.
Yeah. Yeah. Babies are good.
Babies are good, man. Yeah. So, and I think too on the trajectory of it, we'll see. We're hopeful that it will happen sooner rather than later. At the same time, we're a 50-plus-year-old organization, so we're pragmatic and prudential about these things too. They can take time to unfold, and it can take time for people to kind of warm up to it, which we get. Mm-hmm. I think a great analogy, perhaps, for where we might go is something like the history of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act, which initially started to pick up steam. The great Hadley Arcus. Yep. He was one of the pivotal figures pushing this in the 90s and early 2000s. Natural law scholar, professor emeritus at Amherst, over at the James Wilson Institute, all great things. And Hadley and others realized that after the Casey decision in 1992, when it seemed like our hopes were dashed, we just had all these new appointments from Reagan, from Bush, and yet this court again affirms abortion. What are we going to do? They took an incremental approach and they said, we can at least ban, certainly through Congress, the most heinous form of abortion, which was partial birth abortion, which even, they recognized, I think, sensibly, that even many on the left were really, hesitant, reticent to defend this. You can look up what this involves. Live Action has done great animated versions of what partial birth abortion is. This was defended barbarically by many pro-abortion activists. The process was the woman being put into labor and delivering the child to such a point where the child's body is out, lower body, but the head remains in the mother. And at that point, while the child is still in some, nonsense sense, not born, while that head is still in the mother's body, scissors puncture the base of the child's skull and the child's brain is evacuated with a suction machine. That's partial birth abortion. That was one of the things that Roe gave us, that normalized, that taught Americans was not simply okay, but that in fact maybe it's good. Maybe doing that to babies is key to women's equality. Maybe it's key to American empowerment, right? And so Hadley and others recognized through the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act push, let's get rid of this, because this fires our people, kind of like heartbeat bills. It makes sense. People hear about it. They're like, what the heck is this?
Yeah, this is
we
evil.
Allow this? Yeah. That's crazy, right? And so even if you think generally like, I don't want to interfere with somebody's right to choose to kill their child, but I don't think that's the way to do it, right? Maybe that's too gruesome. Well, that took about a decade to get done. Right after Casey, there was a push. Clinton's president. You have Newt Gingrich, but their priorities aren't 100% aligned in this way of immediately going down this path. And so people thought, well, this is crazy. There's not going to be the votes for this. Why are they even trying this? But, it keeps getting reintroduced over and over again, and it picks up steam. People are paying attention in Congress. They're saying this makes sense. You get more and more votes. Changing circumstances. President Bush is elected. You have changing Congress. And so by 2003, the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act is finally passed in Congress, signed by the president. It's immediately litigated, of course, because pro-abortion forces who do the standard double game of like, this isn't happening, but it's good that if it could happen, it should.
Yeah.
They're saying, they litigated at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court even by 2006 rules on this and says, Congress's decision to ban this is totally fine. And so that was a huge victory. It was like, in one of those maybe quieter periods in some sense of the pro-life movement as we continue to work toward Roe's abolition. That was a major success story. And we think, we look at that and we say, that could be kind of a trajectory, timeline, template for making birth free. For those members on either side of the aisle who might initially look at this and not want to do it for whatever reason, let's talk about it. Let's warm up to the idea. Let's look at American history. Let's ask why we can't do this again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We, certainly hope for your success in that. In our closing minutes here, this is such an important issue to so many of young people in American Moments Network that work in Congress. We have a lot of people in our network that hold this issue very close. It's very dear to their heart. If you had advice for people working in Congress that have some sort of say on these pro-life issues, what advice would you give?
Oh gosh, we're thinking of maybe influencing a member, helping give them heart.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing, is to just don't be reticent. Don't think like I better not open my mouth about this, or my member's kind of known as this or that. Maybe not a big social conservative, maybe more of a financial business guy, whatever. No, speak. Because if there's one thing that's rewarded, really in any professional setting, frankly, at least for the type of folks who would be American Moment listeners and fans, it's candor, it's truth. We can have conversations, and we can even agree to disagree if need be, without becoming enemies. That's what hopefully all of America can get back to, right? But certainly, if you're in someone's office, or if you're here in DC on an internship or something, or if you're going to be here, just be upfront, be bold about the possibilities, the opportunities, and if you can, show the way that these issues are going to connect to electoral viability. Voters reward boldness. They reward it. And as long as the candidate is capable of articulating sensibly, soundly, simply why something is good, or why something should be done, or why something was done, why it was voted for, they'll be rewarded at the polls. There's no question about that. And so whether you're talking about something like moving toward making birth free, whether you're talking about any other human right to life issue, from abortion to euthanasia to assisted suicide, people want to imagine an America again that is welcoming, that's actually a land of thriving and possibility, where the dream is still alive, where success isn't going to necessitate putting your folks in a home when they're at whatever age, or because they were struck with whatever condition, because you're in DC or you're wherever and you can't afford to take them in. And I wish they had planned better financially. I wish they had put more money in Fidelity or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, people want to get to an America where we have state policy along the lines of make birth free. State policy that incentivizes parents to live in the homes with their children and their grandchildren, to get us back to that old American status quo of multi-generational families, not just the nuclear family, not just this invented thing of like mother, father, and one or two kids, but family writ large. And so, when you're saying like, what can I do? If you're from a big family working in one of these offices, witness to that. Talk about how great it was to grow up in a big family. Yeah, talk about the challenges too. And if you're not from that background, help raise awareness in some way about the good of human life and about the necessity of every elected representative at whatever level to get involved, to promote it. That's what the state is for. That's what we're all doing here, is we're trying to pass laws to strengthen the country and to promote the common good, to promote the public welfare. And so I think that it's like, if we don't learn to have the courage to do that, and if we don't take the opportunities we have to witness and to speak and to encourage, we're selling our own vision short.
Yeah.
We can do a lot better.
Absolutely. That's a good word. Tom, thank you very much for coming on Moment of Truth. We've wanted to have you here for a long time, so I really appreciate your willingness to be here.
You guys are awesome. Keep it up.
I told you that was going to be quite an interesting episode. You may have some disagreements after listening to Tom and I's conversation, but surely if you're a listener of this show, you can agree that it should be a goal of the conservative movement to support more babies, to support families, which really are the special interest group of the conservative movement. Those are the people that have created this great nation that we live in. So even if you disagree, I would highly recommend that you engage with AUL, that you go and look at all the things they have on their websites, aul.org. And once again, thank you for listening to Moment of Truth. Please rate and review our show. Give us 5 stars. Leave a comment if you're so inclined about how much you love the show, or whether or not you hate my beard, or whatever. And make sure to visit americamoment.org to see more of our programming and things that we have going on. And once again, if you're an intern in DC and you'd like to join AM Fridays, our summer intern training program, that is americamoment.org/AM Fridays. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.